What is up, guys, and welcome to my ranking of all of the Halloween franchise timelines. Now, one thing that does make the Halloween franchise stand out amongst all of the different horror and slasher franchises is that it's kind of a choose-your-own-adventure kind of thing. You have a bunch of different timelines, a bunch of different characters, a bunch of little pieces that connect from one movie from decades ago to movies that were just released a few years back. And so no matter what your flavor of Halloween films are, no matter what your taste is, no matter what you come to these movies for, there's likely one or two timelines that really line up with what you want and one or two that really piss you off. And so last year, while I ranked the masks and the actors and all the different things in this franchise, one thing that I was really looking forward to with the Halloween Ends release is being able to rank all of the different timelines we get in this franchise, of which most of the time people only discuss 5. But I'm going to be discussing 10. Now, as far as what my rules are for what I consider to be a timeline, it has to be a collection of movies to where the end of the timeline could survive as the end of that story. There's no lingering plot threads, there's no cliffhangers, there's no empty feeling at the end of that without the sequel that comes later on. And so the 5 timelines that's traditionally discussed when it comes to this franchise, a few of them I've split up into what I would say is more preferable timelines. And for the really bold out there, let's take a shot every time I say timeline.
I'm gonna fuck you up.
And with all of that being said, guys, let me know all of your thoughts on these different versions of this franchise, these timelines, these movies down in the comment section below. If you want to take some of these away, if you want to add a few that maybe you think would survive just fine that I have not included, please do that, and we'll talk about it down in the comment section below. And with that being said, let's kick it off with what I consider to be the worst timeline in this entire franchise by a landslide, and I don't think I'm going to get a whole lot of argument out of anybody with this one. Number 10 for me is going to be the Resurrection timeline. This one kicks off with the first film in 1978, its sequel in 1981, picks up later on in the late 90s with H2O, and then destroys everything with Halloween Resurrection. Now, as much of a fan as I am of 3 of the movies in this timeline, Resurrection does just about everything it can possibly do to completely fuck up everything that those movies set up. You have Laurie Strode and her story arc and her character arc just completely demolished in the opening 5 to 10 minutes of this film, to where she accidentally murdered somebody, and so now her fate after surviving evil all these years and escaping her brother and all the trials and tribulations this character has been through from Halloween 1, 2, and H2O, her reward is to spend the rest of her life in this mental ward known as a psychotic murdering bitch. And then Michael just comes along and kills her. So yeah, that's enough probably to land this at the bottom, but then you also have, now that the whole sister thing is done, Michael is now motiveless. Now he's just a motiveless killer, which I actually like, but it's done in the worst possible way, where we just stick him with a bunch of random 20-somethings and give a generic 2000s horror film where Busta Rhymes does karate kicks, electrocutes him in the balls, and then he gets burnt Halloween Kills style and opens up his eyes for the rest of his adventures. No adventures follow in this movie ever. Number 9 for me is going to be the zombie timeline, which just consists of the 2 Rob Zombie Halloween films. Now, I don't hate the first film. I do hate the first third of it, but I really do like it once it becomes kind of a heightened version of John Carpenter's Halloween. And I am one of the few people on this planet that will actually defend Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. With that being said, though, this is not my preferred version of Michael Myers or the Halloween lore and storyline. This is much more of a grounded take, to where he's just a messed up kid that's got a fucked up redneck family that kind of ignores him and verbally abuses him, and then he goes nuts and kills them all and becomes this gigantic, like 7-foot tall killing machine for 2 movies. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas to explore in these 2 films. I think it does do a good job of standing on its own amongst all of these movies and the different versions of Michael Myers and Halloween that we have gotten, but it's just not the version of this story that I like to revisit all that much. It's ultra Rob Zombie. There's the redneck stuff, there's the 70s grindhouse, borderline porno stuff in here. And so I got to be in a really specific mood to watch this. Even Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, which I like more than most people. And so when it comes to rewatchability, mainly, this one lands this low on the list for me. Coming in at number 8 is what I'm calling the H4O timeline, and this consists of just the original film in 1978 and the 2018 reboot. Now, you can watch these two films and end 2018 and not move on to Kills and Ends and get a complete story. That's what we thought we were getting when we watched this and we walked out of the theaters in Halloween 2018. Everybody had their speculation, you know, you have, oh, is Myers alive? You know they're gonna bring it back. And with, of course, the box office success, this thing was a behemoth. There was no doubt whatsoever we were gonna get another one, but even if there was a version of events to where this movie wasn't as successful as it was, or maybe they just wanted to do a one and done. If you watch the first film as Michael stalking and terrorizing Laurie, and then watch 2018 as Laurie stalking and terrorizing Michael, even though it's not the most satisfying way to end, and there's a lot more things to be explored in those movies, hence why we got 2 more, you could stop there and just say, hey, that's it. That's the end. She feared the evil, feared the monster for 40 years, and it just terrorized every moment of her life. It destroyed her life, it destroyed her family, and then finally he broke out and she got that son of a bitch and roasted him in this little trap in her basement. Curtains. But if we're going to call that a timeline, which I am, and if we're going to watch those as a 1-2 punch, I'm not the biggest fan of Halloween 2018. I've liked it more as time has gone on. It's something that certain issues I have with it have kind of, I've gotten a little more used to it where it doesn't aggravate me as much, and certain things that the movie does very well, I appreciate more as time has gone on, but it's still not one of my favorite Halloween films by any stretch, so not one of my favorite timelines. Number 7 is going to be the THORN timeline, and this one of course starts with the first 2 films, 1978 and 1981, and then moves into a Jamie Lloyd trilogy with Halloween 4, Halloween 5, and then Halloween 6. Now, there's things about this timeline that I like quite a bit. You'll see a variation of this timeline much higher on this list. I like the fact that they do find a good way to continue the storyline, starting with Halloween 4. That was a great movie to kind of revitalize the Michael Myers version of this franchise after Halloween 3 didn't exactly give what most people wanted. And having it be Laurie Strode's daughter and Michael awakens, and now we're going to go on these trilogy of movies where he's terrorizing this child. I think that that idea was a great idea and was executed damn well at first. Then you get Halloween 5, which, for those that haven't seen my rankings, has always been my least favorite Halloween film for as long as I have been on YouTube. I think that it's among the worst just objectively, story-wise, execution, kills, characters, goofy-ass music when the cops are walking, but there's the added bullshit of it just being a completely boring Halloween film. So I can watch Halloween Resurrection and at least get a little bit of a kick out of how ridiculous it is, where Halloween 5, I just want it to end. And so that brings this timeline down quite a bit just in and of itself. But then you also get the whole Man in Black thing. Even if Halloween 5 was a good movie and a good story and a decent continuation off of Halloween 4, the Man in Black mystery is just kind of something that's weird and sprinkled throughout Halloween 5 and leaves it off on this big cliffhanger to be paid off in really horrible ways in Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers. Now, Curse of Michael Myers, I like decently enough. It's one of those movies that I wish I could find the best cut of this film, and it would probably go up on my ranking a good bit. It's got a great Myers, great atmosphere, some really good kills, but the story, what the fuck are they thinking? You kill off Jamie Lloyd, you get rid of Danielle Harris, there's a whole bunch of stories about how that went down that's just weird and shady as fuck. You have this whole Cult of Thorn timeline to where now Michael's being guided by this Illuminati bitches in the middle of this fucking hospital. You've got the Man in Black is revealed to be this doctor that always worked with Dr. Loomis. It's just all these weird fucking ideas that came out of nowhere that aren't really successfully executed in any cut of this film. Some of them aren't even really brought to a finite conclusion at the end of 6, like the fate of Dr. Loomis, and unfortunately because of the death of Donald Pleasance, they just couldn't continue on. Might have been a good thing for the story of these movies, but it's just a timeline that starts off great and then just gets fucking weird and wacky and stupid Coming in at number 6, we have the most recently closed off timeline, which I'm gonna dub the Haddonfield timeline, which starts off in 1978 with the Golden Classic, the original, and then picks up about 40 years later with 2018 Halloween Kills, and finally the new release Halloween Ends. Now, I call it the Haddonfield timeline because the more the David Gordon Green trilogy went on, it was very clear that he wanted to focus more on the evil in this town and the effects on the town and the town's folk than he actually wanted to focus on Michael Myers and Laurie, despite all of the marketing and all of the focus and all of the fandom wanting it to be about Laurie and Michael. Nonetheless, that's another video. The Haddonfield timeline for me is a mixed bag. Of course, you got the gold original, which is just awesome. And every timeline that it takes place, that's a gold standard right there. You have 2018, which I've already said, I like okay. I'm not as big of a fan of it as most people, but I don't hate it. Kills is a movie that gets worse for me every single time that I watch it. Some awesome kills, hence the title. Michael Myers is great. There's some decent sequences here and there of tension, but story-wise and especially script-wise, I think it's a fucking mess. And then you have Halloween Ends, which I actually like more than most people. I'm in the middle on that film. I'm hovering around 3.5 with it every single time that I discuss it and watch it. And over time, who knows which way I'll sway. But Halloween Ends to me, while I like some of the bold and different ideas, and I like the character of Corey Cunningham, and I appreciate going in a different direction and subverting some of my expectations and giving me a movie I certainly did not expect, there's a bit of a refreshing quality in that. I also think that it is a ridiculous third chapter in this trilogy. I think it has little to no place in this trilogy or this franchise, and I just am baffled at the logic at doing this in the third final chapter of a trilogy instead of just wrapping up your trilogy in the way that was clearly set up and then doing this later on as like an anthology film, because that's what it really feels like. And so when you have the whole product of the first film in the David Gordon Green trilogy, I think there was a lot of potential to have a really great timeline here and a really great slate of movies that for many people would become kind of their definitive Halloween timeline. But unfortunately, because there was just such mixed execution in that David Gordon Green trilogy, that when I think of a good timeline in Halloween, this is not one that comes to mind. Coming in at number 5 is going to be the One Bloody Night timeline, which is just the original 2 Halloween films, which I do think pair really well together. I think that for all of the movies that try to emulate what John Carpenter did, this one does the best job at capturing the feel of it. It's not nearly as good in the script department, it's not nearly as good in the execution department, and it doesn't have nearly the class that the first film does, and certainly doesn't have the staying power or the iconic nature of that first film. But as far as capturing the vibe that Carpenter was going for, and capturing how the shape moves, and how to frame him, and how to shoot him.
I shot him 6 times! I shot him 6 times! I shot him in the heart! I shot him 6 times!
I think the movie gets more right than it gets wrong. Now, the divisive factor of this film is the fact that the story gets pushed to the backside and the kills get brought to the forefront. The first film inspired a lot, if not all, of the 80s slasher films, namely Friday the 13th, which was well known to be put into production to rip off Halloween. And then due to the success of Friday the 13th, they went to Halloween 2 and emulated more of what Friday the 13th did, which is put the story and characters down and just have a lot more gore. And I have a really good time with Halloween 2. I don't think it's a great Halloween movie. I certainly prefer story and characters over carnage. See my thoughts on Halloween Kills. But I can still have a good time with it if I watch it back to back with the first film because they bleed together really nicely. Laurie and Loomis, consistent throughout the 2 films. It comes to a nice dark and poetic ending to where Loomis takes out the evil himself by blowing him up, and Laurie is now free to live her life. And if that was the only Halloween films that we ever got, if Halloween 3 Season of the Witch was a success and we never saw Michael Myers again, it's a pretty nice little 1-2 punch. Number 4 is one that I seriously considered not even putting on this list because for what I'm actually discussing in this video, I really don't think it has much of a place, but it seemed like everybody else that was discussing Halloween franchises and timelines and everything was including this, and I didn't want 1,000 questions asking where this would be. So number 4 for me is going to be the Shamrock timeline, which is just Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Now, for those that don't know, which I don't know how many of you are that don't know this, but Halloween 3 Season of the Witch does not have Michael Myers in it. It's not about Michael Myers, it's not about Laurie Strode, it's not about Haddonfield. It is a completely standalone movie that was meant to kick off a series of anthology films that yearly, bi-yearly, however their plan was. They were going to do different Halloween-themed stories using the Halloween franchise name. At the time of release, everybody said, fuck that shit, and that's why you got Halloween 4, the return of Michael Myers, and the rest of this franchise having that guy be the main focus, because that's what people want when they go to a Halloween film, for understandable reasons. Halloween ends. But for me personally, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch is my second favorite film in this franchise because I just love all the bold, unique ideas. I love the Halloween theme. I love the characters. I love how gnarly and sick and twisted the concept is. I think that it's a great mix of cool and weird and creepy. And I think that it's just highly undervalued and underrated. And as time has gone on, a lot more people have kind of gotten onto what Halloween 3 was trying to do. And it's gained a lot of appreciation and a lot of fandom over time. And so as a timeline, again, when I go to a Halloween movie, I do want to see Michael Myers. That's what I expect to see. That's what I paid my ticket for. That's what I'm sitting my ass in the seat and wanting to watch unleashed, is evil incarnate Michael Myers. But I love this fucking movie, and unfortunately they decided to call it a Halloween film. So because I love it, it's this high on the list. As a timeline, as a standalone film, there's better timelines above it if I'm going to discuss the Halloween franchise. Number 3 is what I'm going to call the Loomis timeline, which starts off with the original film in 1978, moves on to the sequel in 1981, and then culminates in Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Now, Halloween 4 is a movie that I've warmed up to a lot. That is a movie that has steadily climbed my ranking over the past 6 years that I have been discussing this franchise on this channel, and it is now my number 3 movie in this franchise. And over time, who the hell knows, it might actually boot Halloween 3 out of that number 2 slot, because Halloween 4 to me, while I didn't appreciate it at first, is a really great follow-up to the first 2 films. And I think that there's so much about this movie that's executed so well that the fact that it has one of the worst masks in this entire franchise, which is the biggest thing that I held against it for the longest time, it overshadows that the more that I watch it. I mean, you've got Loomis that comes back here after the events of Halloween 2. Not the most believable thing in the world to carry on from Halloween 2, being that Michael's eyes were shot out and he was burned alive and blown up, and so was Loomis, but fuck it, it's a slasher franchise. We can forgive weird continuity once in a while. I mean, fuck, we do it every single time a Friday the 13th movie comes out. And so you got Loomis back, you have Michael that's been catatonic since H2, and then somebody just happens to mention around him that even though Laurie Strode is dead, she has a daughter. And then whoosh, the evil arises again. And what follows is a really great classic Halloween film that tries to do a lot of what the first 2 films does, and I think succeeds in most of it while being its own thing. I think that Michael is performed really well here despite the mask and the shoulder pads. That's also a little bit weird. The kills are great. I love the fact that Michael kind of terrorizes the town systematically to where you get him taking out the power and then taking out the police force and then going after Jamie once those things are done. The mob mentality thing is way better explored and executed in this film than it was in Halloween Kills by a country mile. You have a lot of really great things going on regarding the 2 main characters of Jamie Lloyd, played by Danielle Harris, and Rachel Carruthers. They're a great team together. I mean, both of them individually are good characters, and they both are performed really well, to where a lot of people I actually see saying that they prefer Rachel or prefer Jamie over Laurie Strode, which some would say is sacrilege, and some would say, hell yeah, I'm on that team too. And the ending of Halloween 4, had that actually been an ending, would have been one of the greatest ends of a franchise in horror history. I mean, you have the transference of evil from Michael to Jamie. You have kind of history repeating itself with her doing exactly what Michael did in the opening of Halloween 1978. You have the look of Jamie, who you've been following, this innocent, sweet little girl covered in blood with this clown mask and this knife, and then Loomis's scream, the performance by Donald Pleasance. I mean, all of that paired together just made for a fantastic ending in Halloween 4, which is just one of the other many reasons why I fucking fucking hate Halloween 5 because it completely fucks that up. But if we're to scrub our minds and act like Halloween 5 onward never happened, and then we just had the first 2 films focused on Laurie Strode and then that one classic film focused on her daughter, I think it's one of the strongest timelines in this franchise by a landslide. Number 2 is going to be the PURIST timeline. Shout out to Dave McCrae. And this one consists just of the original film in 1978. And you can watch the original film and act like there is nothing after this. And for some people, that's the best version of this story, that's the best version of this franchise, and that is the best timeline. And it's certainly one of my favorites. It's pretty high up here. I love this franchise. I love a lot of the sequels, and I think that there was certainly a lot of things that merited revisiting this character and the concepts that were brought up by John Carpenter in this original film. But I also think that by design, it was never meant to be continued. And I think that the attitude of John Carpenter shows that. Even though he's kind of famous for being the grumpier old man director, the way that he talks about these sequels to where his favorite part is just putting out his hand and getting a paycheck tells you he doesn't give a fuck about any of these movies, no matter how good or bad they are, because it was never meant to be a franchise, but he's just reaping all the benefits, and fuck it, he should. So you have this original film that's about this kid that just suddenly turns evil, kills his sister, goes away to this insane asylum, and then comes back out and starts stalking babysitters. There's no Laurie Strode being his sister. There's no familial motivations here. There's no motivations. It's just motiveless evil. He's just the shape. He's just darkness behind a mask. The devil's eyes, all those things that Loomis continuously gives you through exposition dialogue throughout this movie, that is what the character is in this original film, and it was never realized or executed as well as this original film. Stalks babysitters just because. Just because. And when you get to the end of the film and Loomis puts 6 shots into him, I shot him 6 times! That was Arnold Schwarzenegger. He gets shot 6 times and falls off of that balcony and hits the ground, and Loomis looks down 30 seconds later, if that, and he's gone, and the movie just ends with still shots of the house and all you hear is his breathing. That just reinforces this idea that Michael Myers is human with this supernatural edge, this unexplained supernatural edge to where he's evil. That's it. That's the only explanation you need. You don't need any backstory about his redneck family. You don't need any cult of Thorn bullshit. You don't need anything about him killing makes him transcend more or any of the other ideas that these other timelines have explored eventually. He's just evil. And as much as I love this franchise and I love a lot of the sequels, that is one of the strongest versions of this story, is just the original film. But my number 1 is the H2O timeline. And this one consists of course, the original film from 1978, the sequel in 1981, and then culminates with H2O. Resurrection is not fucking happening. That is something that somebody made up that never happened. That's some online rumor. It ends with him getting his fucking head cut off. That is the best timeline for me. Now, I grew up watching the original 2 films, mostly the first film, and so I've always loved that movie and always liked the sequel. And H2O was the first Halloween film that I saw on release. I saw it in theaters with my dad, and I have always loved that movie, despite some of the flaws certainly showing over time. And I think when you have those original 2 films as a 1-2 punch, and then you follow up 20 years later with, in my opinion, the best version of Laurie Strode and the best performance by Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode, to where she's broken. She has certainly got a lot of PTSD and she is affected daily by what happened in the original 2 films, but it's in a much more believable, much more grounded way than was what explored in the Haddonfield timeline, the David Gordon Green trilogy. And so that is my preferred version of this character, my preferred version of the trauma that Laurie Strode experiences in later sequels, because it's just more believable to me. She's trying to move on with her life. She has changed her name. She's moved to California. She's this headmistress of this prestigious private school, and she's got her son who she's damaging even more, again in a much more believable and entertaining way than was what portrayed in Halloween 2018 with Judy Greer's character. You have a really great cast in this movie, full of all of those young hot stars that some are still around, some were just kind of around in that era. You have some pretty good kills throughout the movie, not nearly the goriest or the most intense of this franchise. Even in this timeline, Halloween 2 is significantly gorier than H2O, but still some good standout kills. And for a problem that's actually much more significant and hurts the films much more in other timelines, I actually think the absence of Loomis isn't a huge hole in the heart of this movie, because you get enough explanation from the little bit of dialogue that Laurie gives about Michael and evil and how he has traumatized her without it getting so fucking ridiculous and heavy-handed the way that it was in the David Gordon Green trilogy. So despite it being a movie that certainly takes its time to really get going, despite not having the best Michael Myers, although I think that he's overly hated as far as Chris Duran's performance, despite having a gigantic debacle with the masks. I mean, what the fuck, guys? Seriously, that one I can't forgive you on. The third act of this movie is one of the best third acts in this franchise, and the ending of this film, with Laurie just taking charge and taking that van and holding everybody up on gunpoint and racing Michael off, knowing that his ass is going to get back up, pinning him, and then chopping his fucking head off. That is the best ending to any film in this franchise, and that is the best ending to any timeline in this franchise. And so for me personally, despite some of the flaws that are certainly agreeable and apparent throughout these three movies, mostly the other two, not the original, this is the best timeline of Halloween for me. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this, please click over here for a playlist of all of my Halloween reviews, and I'm also going to put my most recent Halloween ranking up here if you just want to discuss the movies. Please like and share this video and hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this and you want to check out all of the other content that I have coming out in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.